I've never not had the privilege to vote or to have to go into a separate waiting room or anything like that. So it was a very eye-opening experience for us to get to know one another. But the newspaper, Stanley Dearman, my predecessor, really played a role in 10 years ago tomorrow, a man was convicted for murder, manslaughter actually, in the case. It was the first criminal prosecution successful. But that came about because of the local newspaper, because Stanley Dearman spent about 50 years getting the town ready for this. In 1989, they had a 25th anniversary commemoration to where Dick Malthus came and gave an apology. The families were there for the first time. And to those of us in Philadelphia, it began to put a human face. But the thing that Stanley Dearman did was leading up to this commemoration, he went to New York and he interviewed Carolyn Goodman, who was Andrew Goodman's mother, one of the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered in Neshoba County. And prior to that, all we knew of them really would be the picture, the missing picture that you've all seen. That was kind of my image growing up as a kid. So we didn't really know these folks. Maybe even heard that they were dirty or that they just came down here and they got what they deserved. But Stanley went to New York and interviewed Mrs. Goodman. She was a physician. She was a psychiatrist. I believe they were a very prominent family in Manhattan. But he, at the time I was working at the Ruth and Stanley, and the highlight of my week was to get to the Neshoba Democrat, my hometown paper. And the Democrat arrived that week, and then there was a story about the 25th anniversary. But then there was a story about Mrs. Goodman and talking about Andrew. And for the first time, he learned that Andrew Goodman was athletic. He loved dramatic arts. He was a peacemaker. His friends, he was always settling arguments amongst his friends. And he had a garden that they had out in Connecticut that he loved being outdoors. And at that point in the interview, I really began to connect and think, well, this could be one of my friends. I was about that age. And it put a face on it for most of us. But Miss Goodman, in the interview, Stanley did it so well. It was a transcript of her just talking. But that was the point that she broke down, talking about her son and describing what he was like. But for the town, it did a lot of good. Prepared us for the 40th and for eventually be a successful prosecution. But the call for justice, we were planning the 40th, and Stanley was on the committee, and we all didn't really know each other well at the time, and we were just getting together and saying, well, why are you here, John, or why are you here, Bill, and everybody just kind of would tell their story. Then it got down to planning the actual event, and Stanley Dearman was the one that said, there's an elephant in the room. We can't just be planning an event when we don't acknowledge what really happened here. And that was, he went home that night, he wrote the call for justice that ultimately, with just a few tweets, was what the community stood together and said, which was a high point in the life of that town, in my hometown, because we'd all had this burden of guilt of you know, you went anywhere in Philadelphia, they either knew Marcus Dupree or the Civil Rights Movement, and there was always a negativity involved. But that was a highlight. But it was Stanley Dearman who wrote the call for justice. And the thing about the call for justice, it started with, we called on the President of the United States, went all the way down, and the district attorney was the last person on our list. So it fell to Leroy Clemens and I gave the co-chair of the coalition to go to the DA with this call for justice that we had. And I was scared to death. Mark Dunagin is just a very serious DA. I know him a lot better now, but I was scared to death to go in to see see Mark, but we had to do it. Leroy and I did. Mark kind of looked at it, and it's this deadpan sense of humor, but he gets his pen out, and he writes his name at the top. And he said, if you're going to call for justice in this county, you need to start with me. I'm the district attorney. So for Leroy and I, we thought, wow, that's great. That was a good thing. So, but the call for justice, Stanley wrote it, but he had prepared his whole career. He had prepared the community to be able to accept this. So where are we today? We're like a lot of communities. There are a lot of challenges that are before us. But I think because we know one another better, we've been having this discussion for 50 years. And I think that the reason we so successfully were able to get together on the 40th and call for justice is we just knew one another. We knew one another. And we now, I've been knowing the black mayor since I was in college, writing for the Neshoba Democrat. He was a paramedic at the hospital. He started as a janitor, but the hospital administrator saw in him potential and sent James off to paramedic school. And Philadelphia has, if you call an ambulance in Philadelphia, you get a paramedic. And that's unusual. You get that in Jackson and metro areas, but Philadelphia was outside of the metropolitan areas, was the first rural place to have paramedic level service. It was partly James Jones doing. So now he's our mayor. But we all just got to know each other. Leroy Clemens and I, who was the NAACP chairman, still is, he worked at the newspaper. He wrote sports, and I wrote news. And we would have to, after we stuffed the paper at night, it would fall to Leroy and I to drive the Dearman's truck back to their house and park it. So I got to know Leroy in that role. So providentially, in so many ways, we were prepared to have this discussion. We still need to have it. And I think we're here today to hear from these folks who lived it. I was 3 months old to the day when the murders happened. So I'm sort of post-civil rights, my generation. Marcus Freed was a senior when I was a senior. And so we're like post-civil rights. But these folks lived it. There was a point during the 40th that I really realized that I might have to take a bullet because there were some threats and things said, not locally, none of it was local people, but anytime you're on national news or as I was yesterday on NPR, that's when all the real crazies, they talk about a lot of stuff. But these folks who actually lived it in the 60s, and that's one thing that as we were preparing for the trial in Philadelphia, there was a lot of anxiety over the jury selection. And people were afraid. They were afraid because I didn't know Edgar killed. If he had walked in, I wouldn't have known him. I do now. But these are evil people. They are evil. And it's a sickness, it's a sin, and it blew up in my hometown. And we don't know why. Turner Catlett grew up in Philadelphia, and he edited the New York Times, and he would write back to people, and it bothered him. Mrs. Catlett told me till the day he died, he was upset and concerned and never quite fully understood why what happened in Philadelphia happened. But we're moving ahead and taking it as I think John Lewis said the other day that on Sunday in Philadelphia at the 50th, at the little church that was burned, he said that Neshoba County is demonstrating how divisions can be put aside and how we can move forward. So for that outside observation, that means a lot to us, and I think in Mississippi, because we have an extraordinary role of being a leader. And in so many ways you are, and many of you, your communities are doing a lot of good. So I'm going to be quiet and let these guys talk, but I'm going to introduce Matt Williamson, who's the managing editor of the Enterprise-Journal in McComb, and he's going to introduce our panelists.
Thanks, John. despite my looks, I don't have intimate knowledge of covering the civil rights movement in the 60s, but I have a couple of guys up here who do, and I'm sure most of you know W.C. Shoemaker and Charlie Dunagin. Doug used to work for the Jackson Daily News, and Dunagin was his competitor with the Jackson State Times. And so they covered a lot of it. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Competitor / mentor.
I was his mentor, and I all the things I told him.
But yeah, I definitely wanted to hear some of their stories from covering the 60s. And Doug, I guess we'll start with you. And yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot. And I think really before we start talking about the summer 64 and Neshoba, we probably ought to back it up a few months towards the summer of 63 to a pinnacle moment in your career. That was the night of the Medgar Evers assassination. And why don't you talk to us about that and your relationship with Medgar? And it's good to go.
Does this work?
Yeah, indeed.
I'm not skilled at doing this. I worked for the Daily News for a long time, about 15 years, except for a break, 2 years in the military in the Korean War, until 1965, and I got out and got in small town business. The civil rights movement, in my judgment, I'll try to be quick, was one of the most, I've done programs on this, and I talk about the four most significant times in the history of this nation. That'd be the American Revolution, when we got free from the British, the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, when we discovered the steam engine and the cotton gin and that sort of thing, and then what happened in the 1960s, which I call the Lifestyle Revolution. And I was lucky enough to be a reporter right in the middle of where that was happening in those years, and it was a fascinating time. It came to a peak in 64, probably because of a number of things, and the most significant of those things was the death the year earlier, 1 year almost to a week earlier, of Medgar Evers, who ran the NAACP. I don't know, who knew Medgar Evers? Anybody? Okay. Mr. Evers was from East Mississippi, over near Newton, DeKalb. He was in World War II, went to school at Alcorn College, became an insurance agent in the all-black community up in the Delta, and then later came to Jackson to become the field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi. It developed into the dominant civil rights organization in the state, and he was an interesting person. He did not support confrontations. I knew him well, and we talked regularly. But I asked him about it a number of times, and he said, "Why fight in the street when we win the courts?" When they had a demonstration planned at some public event, he would call Mr. Pierce, M.B. Pierce, who ran the Jackson. He wasn't the chief of police in Jackson, but he was probably the number 2 man. And he would call him up, and he called him chief, and Pierce called him Medgar. And he'd say, "Chief, this is what we got to do." And Pierce would say, "Well, I'll call you back." I heard both the conversations a few times. And Pierce would call the city's legal people and get advice on how the police should react, and call Medgar back and tell him what they were going to do. Then, in the 63, that movement had really gained, and there were regular meetings. An example of Evers' opposition to physical contact. About a week before he got killed, there was a rally at Pearl Street AME Church. I was there. And the pastor, Reverend Halton, H-M-U-G-H-T-A-N, was the speaker up on the stage. And he was unhappy. The room was full of people. He was unhappy with ABC television because of some coverage they had done on something that happened a day or two earlier. And he started chatting, and the audience, the room was full of people, white folks mostly, and including the ABC television people, they were there. And they all stood up in their pews and started pounding on the back of the pews, and get them, and get them, and get them. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I was sitting right behind the television crowd, and Major was sitting on a chair back in the dark on the stage, and he got up and he grabbed Hawking by the shoulder and pushed him down away from the microphone and said, "Sit down," and the crowd just melted. He, as an example of had he lived, I think we would have had the result. I think would have been the same, but we would have had much less confusion. I visited with him about 9:30 the night he got killed at a rally on a little church, and he did not go home when the meeting broke up. We stood around and talked, I smoked cigarettes in those days, stood outside and talked for a few minutes after the meeting was over, and he went over to a black attorney's house, Jack Young, and Miss Young made him a sandwich, and they played nickel poker till midnight. They loved playing nickel poker. We used to all gather and play cards in the restaurant. And he went home, and whoever did it was waiting for him. And he got out of his car. Will, are you here? Yeah, there he is. A year ago, Will and I went to Major's house, films and stuff there. Dr. Norton is the chair of the School of Journalism and Ole Miss. And Major got out of his car a little after midnight, walked across the driveway down toward the front door, and somebody shot him from the area over in the woods. Hit him in the back shoulder, the left side behind the heart. Sent him out on the right side, left the bullet about big as your fist. And the bullet went through an exterior wall of the house, went through an interior wall of the house, ricocheted off a shelf on the stove, and landed on the counter. I was with the police next day when they found him. And then the man who did it did not take the rifle with him. He just went about 50 yards and stuck it in a briar patch. And the police found it the next morning. We put a description of the serial number of the rifle in the paper, and that put the police, that man who had owned it called Pierce and told him that used to be his rifle. He took him down and put him on by and made back with him. They started trailing him. I'll get to Philadelphia in a second. And the police department put a team of people watching him 24 hours a day. He was a salesman who sold fertilizer in Greenwood. Lived over in Terrell County, near Tarleton, and had a big mouth. The FBI put a team watching him, and that went on for 7 days, and nothing had happened. The bullet was so badly damaged they could not even prove technically that it came out of that rifle, whatever was damaged. And Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General of the United States, President Roy, ordered the FBI to arrest him. Well, Roy Moore, who ran the FBI in Mississippi, told Pierce they were instructed to arrest him, and Pierce told his people to arrest him. And his words were, "We ain't going to play politics with a murder case." And he had his people arrested, and that was the only case he had. The only thing they had was that he had owned the rifle. But anyway, as the Major died in June of 2013, that man killed him. The leadership of the civil rights movement changed dramatically in Mississippi. There were several other lesser active civil rights groups called, I've forgotten their name, but they were not nearly as strong, didn't have the membership or the active participation as the NAACP. It was strong. They created a new organization they called COFO, Council of Federated Organizations, and they brought somebody I'd never heard of, to say his name with that, and run it. And I don't know if it's a result of during that time or following that time, we went into a more full-scale civil rights movement, and more direct contacts and stuff like that. In the summer of '64, what they call Freedom Summer, a college up in Ohio served as a rendezvous point for mostly young people come out around the country, and they would meet there and then come down here into Mississippi and go into activities. And And that's where the killing came from. Is one, I've got some notes, I guess I'm old, I can't remember names. Two young men, Andrew Goodman, who was 20, Mickey Schwerner, who was 24, both of them white boys, white men from New York. In that college in Oxford, Ohio, they met up with James Cheney, a white man from Meridian. And they rode the bus jointly down to Meridian to come down here and get involved. Somebody had burned the Black Community's church a few days earlier, and on I guess it was the 20th of June, 50th birthday. The three of them went out there from Meridian and rode out there in a car, and one of them's car was driving. And it may have been, I think it was Cheney's car. And they rode out and looked at the church, and in the course of the evening, going back, I guess, toward Meridian or wherever, they got stopped for speeding by a deputy sheriff named Cecil Price. Mr. Price arrested the driver for speeding, supposedly 65 in the 35 zone, put them all three in jail. They stayed in jail 2-3 hours and paid a $20 fine and got out and disappeared. They never made it back to Meridian that night. That was on a Sunday night, as I recall. The next day, about 12 miles northeast of Meridian on Highway 21, in a wooded area alongside a creek, about 100 yards off the highway down the trail, some man, I think it may have been a chop shop, found the car, had been burned, and called the authorities. So that got them going. And they couldn't find the people. Nobody knew anything about it. That went on for 6 weeks until the first week in August of 64. They got a tip. The authorities got a tip that, and by then the federal government had sent in the Navy out of Meridian Naval Air Station, a lot of other soldiers, a lot of law enforcement people had searched all over the area. Matter of fact, the teenagers would go out and take pine straw and make believe graves all out in the woods, so they had something to dig into. But they didn't dig up the dirt. I saw a couple of them. They just mounted up the dirt, and that went on and on and on. And, a man I knew who was a freelance writer, lived in Montgomery, Alabama, told me this. The FBI put up $30,000 as a reward for the bodies. And he told me that he met two men in the Chelsea Hotel in Memphis, and he had the FBI's $30,000 in his briefcase on the floor beside his feet. And the two men sat down on the other side, and he said he stacked money on the bed while they told him where the bodies were. And he said he paid her $20,000. He never would tell me what he did with the other $10,000 of my money. And he's gone now. He told them where they were, or they told him supposedly where they were. Then in the course of the day, the FBI blocked off access to a farm pond out about 5-6 miles southwest of Meridian, on a farm owned by a man named Odin Burridge, Burrage. He was in the trucking business, had 18-wheelers, all something I forgot. And they wouldn't let anybody out there look. I did sneak down the dirt road and saw the pond, but they wouldn't let me go down there and take a picture or anything. One of the agents told me about the trail for them to peek. So I went back to the office, and that night I got in trouble. I hired a small airplane. Told him I wanted him to circle that pond the next morning with a photographer aboard, Jack Thornell. And circled it as low as Jack wanted him to go, as many times as he wanted to go. The only one rule was he had to be back on the ground in Jackson by 7:30 so he could get in the first mission to the mission. And he did. Mr. Moore saw the paper that afternoon afternoon, he called me, and he said, "Don't you know that pond was off limits?" And I said, "Mr. Moore, I know y'all own the sky." And he laughed, that's okay. But they found the bodies buried about 12 feet deep. The pond, the dam had been built about a month, 6 weeks, or whatever before, about 200 feet long, and they found the bodies about 14 feet to 12 feet deep down in the dam. They brought them, that same day the sheriff brought them to University Medical Center in Jackson and did autopsies, and they found bullets in them. And that went on and on. They never did have a local indictment. They talked about it, and he went to court. Eventually, it fumbled around for a while, and about 3 years later, it went into federal court on a charge of violating the civil rights of these people by killing them. And they arrested, I think, 12 people, including the sheriff and the deputy, and many others, including the man you talked about. They had the trial in Meridian, and I found note of the name here, I got to find him. They went up and on, and they had about 100 witnesses who testified in behalf of the 12 people who were on trial. 10 of them were on trial there. 2 pleaded guilty, and 1 was sentenced in a federal court in Gulfport. The other was sentenced in the federal court in Atlanta, where they were living. And at that time, in my head, I've always made up my mind, those were the 2 that my friend met in Memphis and got the information from, because they didn't go out in Sherwood County. Well, the trial was going on, and John Doerr was an assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department, and he was a great big tall fellow. He'd been to Mississippi and made everything at Ole Miss. I'm sorry, the utility. Whatever the thing at Ole Miss, 2 years earlier when they desegregated school, he'd been one of the government lawyers there. He was a tall fellow from Minnesota with a Swedish background. And the man who was defending Laurel Ware was one of the lawyers in Philadelphia who was defending some of the people. And he put a man on this witness stand to testify in behalf of one of the suspects. And he answered Mr. Ware's questions, and he turned him over to John Doerr. And Doerr asked him a question, and he wouldn't answer it. And he asked him several times, and he wouldn't answer it. And he turned to Judge Harold Cox, who was Mr. Bad Guy, federal judge. And he said, you will answer the attorney's questions. And the witness turned back to Mr. Ware, Laurel Ware. He said, "Mr. Laurel, who he?" And brought the house down. Everybody laughed at Cox. But they convicted 4, and convicted 8, I believe. And then 2 had pleaded guilty elsewhere, and they served. They did not convict the sheriff, they turned him loose. And Lawrence Rainey, I believe was his name, wasn't it? But they did convict Price, and they served prison terms. And then that other thing came along almost 25 years later or so. And that really is what set off the more violent civil rights movement all across the state. There had been numerous beatings and shootings and stuff in various towns in many places around Mississippi. But this is the one that got so much attention. And I think I've always thought that it came out of the Ku Klux Klan. There was 2, the FBI told me, there was 2 clavers of the Klan in Mississippi. The United Klan, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which was led by that man down at Laurel who was pretty outspoken and had activities in the Meridian area, and apparently some in Neshoba County too. And then the United Klans out of southwest Mississippi, Natchez, McComb, in that area. But I've always felt like it came out of that, the White Knights put this all together. But that really set off the turn in what that, and of course Kennedy was president until November 63 when he got killed. He did not, I have transcripts of conversations between him and Ross Barnett and Paul Johnson, the lieutenant governor, regarding the desegregation of Ole Miss. We had had 33,000 troops up there and all the U.S. Marshals and stuff like that in 1962. And Kennedy did not push racial confrontations, but he said the law is the law and we've got to do it. And of course, when he got killed, Lyndon Johnson came along and we passed new laws and made it a primary part of what's happening in the country. It's interestingly now, 50 years later, our memories have changed. My grandfather told me that when he was a young man, that men, males, could vote, black or white, provided they were property owners. Women didn't vote, and non-property owners didn't vote. But once the rich was, he had a neighbor who farmed next to him, who was a white man, and he told me in his old age that they would get together and decide who they were going to vote for. But we've made massive changes and in where the country's going. I'm not saying it's good or bad. My job was not to tell you it's good or bad. My job was to just write it in 8th grade language so you go where it was. And my job, the people who owned the Daily News in those days, the Hedman family, wrote some rules about the fact that what you could say. You couldn't call a black man Mr. You couldn't call a black woman Mr. Mrs. You just use their name. And you had to put their race behind their name, the word Negro. And that was their decision, the corporate decision. I guess they made that decision. They told me to do that, and that's what I did. But it was a fascinating time to be in the news business. And turning hair white, but it was, after Mr. Dunagin tells you a whole lot of stuff, I'll try to answer your questions.
And this wasn't just confined to Jackson or Neshoba County. It's probably a very little known secret of a lot of people that Charlie and I, McComb, also had a significant place in the civil rights movement. And through the course of summer of 1964, there were actually 34 bombings in the city. Oh, is it not on? Can you hear me now? There we go. It's just it's a matter of angle. All right, but yeah, like I was saying, McComb also had a significant place in the civil rights movement. Summer of '64, we had 34 bombings that went off around the city. I guess from early that spring, late winter until about September.
April, I think, was the first one.
Yeah, well, why don't you tell us give us a little bit of chronology of what happened around McComb that year.
Okay. This ain't working?
Yeah, better than mine.
Hey, I mentioned someone a while ago that I saw in the newspaper a couple of days ago where Pelham, Mississippi, where I went to high school and grew up, is the safest city in the state, above 10,000. And I'm proud of that. But when I got to McComb in 1964, believe me, it was not the safest city in Mississippi or anywhere else, especially for moderate newspaper reporters and editors. I started my journalism career in 1957, long after Doug Shoemaker started his in Jackson, Mississippi, on a paper that no longer exists. And I covered some civil rights stuff up there. I was there for 5 years. That's when the Freedom Riders came in. Medgar Evers was still alive then. It was not nearly as violent then as it came
1964, which I think probably is the watershed year of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. From Jackson, I went to Florida for a few months, Jacksonville, and then worked in Hattiesburg with Leonard Van Slyke. He was a young man, I was a teenager, but just the opposite. I was real young, and he was a high school kid. Then I went to McComb in '63, just in time for the violence that broke out in 1964, and it was a brutal summer for just about everyone that lived there. As Matt said, he said 34. I thought it was more like 25, but maybe we're just counting different, because just about everything happened. Churches were bombed, people were beaten. There was a lot of dynamite exploded. Oliver Emmerich White's grandfather, who owned the newspaper and who I worked for as managing editor, he had been assaulted by someone before I got there for, I'm not sure what. I think the Enterprise-Journal was always hospitable to out-of-town newsmen that came in. And Mr. Emmerich was not proposing desegregation in those days, but he was a moderate, and he believed in law and order, and he editorialized to that. And he was, and I'm not saying this because I worked for him for all these years, but he was a great man. He was a Christian man who believed in doing the right thing regardless of race. And he was also willing to put his pocketbook with his principles. Unlike a lot of other publishers in the state, he wasn't the only one, but he lost advertising. And again, we were not advocating desegregation. We were covering the news, and we tried to cover it fairly. To be frank, if you go back and look at our stories, they were no doubt slanted toward law enforcement. They were our main sources of information. But the Klan, the people who were perpetuating the violence, their theory was that if they could intimidate the civil rights people, that it would eventually go away and they could fight this off. And they said that the more publicity these people got, the more they would advance their cause. And looking in retrospect, they were right. It wasn't local publicity so much as it was a publicity that we were getting elsewhere. McComb became known as the dynamite capital of the world, and we're a small town, but we were making the national news on TV with all these bombs. And it does say it was the result of COFO. They would pick a hot spot that they felt like they would get a lot of reaction, and McComb was a likely place. We had sort of a history of violence, blue-collar type people, a lot of railroad workers there at the time, people who didn't mind resorting to fighting and violence for whatever they thought was right. So these people came in, mixed groups, which was unheard of at that time. They lived together, and their main focus was voter registration. Earlier, they were challenging restaurants and Jim Crow practices in public facilities. But the COFO was mainly putting on schools, trying to get black people to go vote or go register to vote. And they were getting all this bombings and trying to intimidate them into leaving. And make a long story short, and I'll leave it open to questions. This went on from about April until about October, when finally some people who were actually involved in the bombings and the beatings, about a dozen, it was either 11 or 13, around figures of about a dozen of them were arrested. Now I'm sure that they had some financial backers that never had to pay the price. But the FBI finally cracked the case. They tried them in state court. They copped a plea. They all pleaded guilty to lesser crimes on the terms that they would get probation. And the judge and the judicial system in Pike County got a lot of criticism for that, for the leniency of those sentences. But I said at the time, and in retrospect, I think I'm right, the judge, he suspended those sentences, but they all got about 5 years probation. He told them if there were any more acts of violence, whether they were involved in it or not, that their probation would be revoked and they'd go partial. So they and their friends and their families, they took that pretty seriously, and that didn't completely stop it, but it pretty much stopped all the violence. And from then, things really began to get more peaceful. It's not to say that it's utopia there, but the city of McComb now has 3 black slave men and 3 white slave men. We've had a black sheriff in the county. We've had a black mayor of McComb. Things are racially pretty calm. There's still a lot of distrust. But people 50 years ago would not have imagined how it is today. And I think people today can really appreciate how rough it was about 50 years ago. All I was doing was writing stories. One with Charles Gordon, a guy who was older than me, was already there. We were writing most of the stories and put them on the front page. And I had a threatening note on an unlit firebomb thrown at my house. We had crosses burned at the paper. Mr. Emmerich had a cross burned in front of his house on the night that his mother died. And somebody called him the next day and apologized and said, had we known your mother died yesterday, we wouldn't have done it that day. I could go on the rest of the afternoon telling
I think we should mention the role that Oliver Emmerich played in helping diffuse the situation by writing statement principles in the newspaper.
Yeah, that's another thing. Mr. Emmerich told me, we had a lot of conversations. I worked for him for 15 years. I think he was 65, I believe, when I went to work at the Enterprise-Journal, and he died at 80 or 81. And I took his job after he died. I became the editor. But we went on a lot of trips together. We went from metal type to offset type during that time. We went to other newspapers and looked at it. But during the civil rights time, his philosophy was, and he was unlike our Harkey and Pascagoula, who I think won the Pulitzer Prize, Hazel Brown Smith and Lexington. Some of them were real outspoken, and they basically destroyed their businesses because of the white reaction. Mr. Emmerich said that the civil rights, the racial attitudes in the South was like a boil or rising. And if you tried to lance it too quickly, it would only make it worse. His idea was that things had to come to a head before they would get better. Throughout the summer, he ran editorials urging people to stay calm, to obey the law, but things kept getting worse and worse. Business was falling off throughout the town. People were afraid to come to town. The rumor got out that the governor might declare martial law if there were any more incidents like that. And finally, business people got tired of it. Most of the citizens got tired of it. And Mr. Emmerich and some other leaders in the town got together and drafted a statement of principles, they called it. Basically, and this was after I believe this was after one of the civil rights laws was passed. It was in '64, and I'm not sure just when it was. But that statement called for an end of violence, for obeying laws, including federal laws, that you might even disagree with. And some 300 or more people in town signed that statement. We ran it in the paper with a full-page ad. That came along about the same time as the arrest, and along with the arrest, that really helped stem the violence.
You mentioned that you had been targeted some with some of the threats. Doug, did you ever experience anything personally?
Yeah, a little bit. Interesting. I was sitting here thinking about it. And a lot about that time, I don't know. I was married then, and has since died several years ago. But we lived out off Clinton Boulevard, and I would get nasty phone calls at night about what was in the paper and what ought to be in the paper, and cars driving by and honking the horn and throwing stuff in the yard and stuff like that. And I found out through the police department and the FBI that it was activities of the APWR, the Americans for the White-Collar Ku Klux Klan, the Americans for the Preservation of the White Race. So this went on, and Mr. Pierce and Miss Pierce we'd feed them sometimes at the house, and they'd feed us sometimes. We were over there. And he told me who ran that organization, and he laid me out a game plan. Told me to go down there and tell him to get off my back. So I said, okay. He was a salesman for an automobile dealership on South State Street in Jackson. So one morning, the next day, I went down there about 7:30, and I saw parked out just outside the entrance 2 unmarked cars, and one of them said 2 FBI agents, and the other said 2 plainclothes Jackson cops. So I went inside and told him to get off my back, or else I was going to kill him. He claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. But I felt real strong because I knew my buddies were out there. And it did calm down. But you had people on both sides would call you and threaten or talk about what they didn't like, or sometimes you got just as upset when you call you about what they didn't like, because you need to be independent. It was interesting. Another example, we were down in Charlie's, they were in Mississippi one time, I forgot what year it was. Something was going on, and there was a Jewish-looking fellow who was a photographer from the Associated Press there. And the people were giving him a bad time, some of the whites, about not liking what the AP was carrying. He lived in Dallas, and he was writing this report, I think, and he got all this torn up. And one of the FBI agents came and told me that he wants to go home, he wants to get out of here. So me and the FBI agent got in my car, and drove him to New Orleans and then he'd catch a plane back to Dallas just to get out. One more thing and I'll shut up. There's a good rumor going around, Charlie, I've never mentioned this to you, you may know all about it, that Byron Taylor Beckwith did not pull the trigger that killed Edgar Evers. There's a rumor that he loaned the rifle. Keep in mind, all they had was the rifle was found out in a little patch of briars about 50 to 75 yards from the house where he was in. And I never did understand why it was left there. The police found it next morning. Why the man didn't take it on with him. But the rumor that I've heard from various sources that a man down in southwest Mississippi on his deathbed told his two sons that he did it. He was a part-time minister of some sort, I don't know what faith. But I don't know that for sure.
I never heard that.
But, and I never had the guts to go ask the boys. So I'm out of the news business now, so I didn't have to.
Doug, that rumor has been around Greenwood for a while. I'm from Greenwood. But it was someone who lived in Greenwood who was a marksman who actually fired the shot. And Beckwith took the fall for it because he had a big mouth.
Yeah, he did have a big mouth. He ran for lieutenant governor right after that. And he would walk in the office, and I would try to hide from him. And he'd say, I'm the whatever. And they say, kill that whatever. I'm not going to miss it.
Yeah, he bragged. I think there's a waitress who testified against him that he bragged in a restaurant that but that the talk around town was there was another man.
He did. He had a big mouth. I saw him lots of times. Tried to stay away from him, but he ran. I think he was lieutenant governor, wasn't he? Byron Taylor Beckwith ran for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, I think he ran for something.
Got about that many votes. But one thing I left out was the man who told me he told the authorities where the bodies were in Philadelphia. And did I tell you about the book he wrote? Look magazine piece. He wrote a piece for Look magazine in the Emmett Till case, in which Mr. Bryant and Mr. Milam confessed that they had killed that boy, Emmett Till. And he said he met with them at a lawyer's office in Sumner, where the trial was held, and paid him $3,500 for the trial for the information. And said he wrote him a denial. He said, you're going to live this doggone Delta, so you better deny it. He wrote him a denial. I read it in Look magazine. Nothing ever came of it after that. He also wrote a biography of the man who flew the Enola Gay, the bomb the first atomic bomb that we used to drop on Japan in World War II. Man from Phoenix. He wrote a biography of his life. So he's dead now, as far as I know.
Matt, one of the stories, innocent stories that came out of that, before I came to McComb, in either 61 or 62, they had a rash of violence when the Freedom Riders came down there, and that might have been when you had to get the guy out because they had a bunch of just local hoodlums down there, just roughnecks that would like to beat people up, and especially these civil rights workers and out-of-town reporters. In fact, one reporter from New York, someplace, got knocked through a plate glass window right next door to the Enterprise-Journal. He was going there, and some guy hit him and knocked him through there. Well, Charlie Gordon, who some of you probably remember, he was a long-time reporter at the Enterprise-Journal and really covered a lot of the civil rights stuff. Nobody had threatened him at the time, but after this guy got knocked through the plate glass window, he decided that maybe he would need to get some protection, so he bought a little 25 caliber revolver that he could stick in his pocket. And he went down to Gillis' drugstore, which was a hangout. They had a soda fountain there in those days, and people went by there to get coffee. He went down there and he showed it to his buddies there. one of them said, look, you need to file the side off that thing and oil it up real good. And he said, why? He said, because when somebody rams it up a certain part of your anatomy, it will hurt someone.
I don't know if anybody's going to be able to top that. Any questions you might have?
I have a question, and I'm from Louisiana, and my dad was Gordon Nelson, and he was with you guys in that Freedom Summer, and you remember the Kosciusko Citizen? It seems like your name's familiar to me. Yes, Mr. Shoemaker. It is Gordon Nelson, the Kosciusko Citizen up in North Louisiana. Okay, well, I wanted to just see if you happen to remember him, because I know there was some, he infiltrated the Klan up there, and so did a reporter from the Shreveport Times. But I questioned him a long time about what happened. We had crosses burned on our yard. The newspaper door was shot out. Little black child delivery paper got shot. It was pretty nasty stuff. And eventually, FBI came down. It eventually was solved by the strangest thing. The violence stopped when the FBI got the names of the businessmen in the Klan. And my father threatened to publish who was in the Klan. And those individuals didn't want to lose the black customers. And the whole thing settled down overnight. He said nobody knows that. I mean, my dad said nobody knew that. Everybody thought it just kind of, they worked it out. The Klan calmed down. Until then, the Klan was very active. But when the businessmen in the community thought they were losing money from the black customers, that calmed the Klan down, and it all went peaceful.
It's interesting, I didn't know about that, thank you.
I've never heard that from anybody else.
It's interesting, the things that have happened in the 50 years, the new direction of the country. And by the way, I covered the first school desegregation in New Orleans. It was 3 big Catholic schools that desegregated, and the mob of Catholic adults, I guess they were Catholics, got in the streets and just put on demonstrations. And the first time I ever saw such a thing, the only time I ever saw it, the New Orleans Police Department had about 25 horses. So they put policemen on the horses and tried to control the mob around the streets of downtown and also down to City Hall and that sort of stuff. I forgot what year that was. When you always meet, all run together.
I interject something? Let's do it. Absolutely. Part of my background, I was 3 months old the day when this happened, but academically, my thesis, thanks to Will Norton at Ole Miss, was a study of this, and I had to go back and interview people and talk to folks, and I think that today what y'all need to understand that I found out, these people were evil. They're evil to the point of just evilness, and that's the sort of thing that maybe like in McComb and Philadelphia, the business community, they were, the money mattered, and the people were scared of the Klan because they might burn them out or do something harmful to their family. But it's a sort of evilness that just to be near it, direct killing, you can feel it. And I don't know if it was that way, if you had your folks who, like my parents, were concerned with raising me and my dad and his business, and they just never raised their hand and did anything. So, but I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that when we even talk about things today, I told Debbie Elliott from NPR, I said, the sort of problems we have today are more cultural. You don't necessarily have the actual sort of evil that people would take 3 young men out on a darkened road in Neshoba County and shoot them at point-blank range. Kill them. That's the sort of hate that we beat down in, and if we don't know our history, if we don't talk about it, we're doomed to repeat it. But maybe y'all could talk a little bit about
I agree that that some of those things and some of those people were evil, but everyone who was resisting the civil rights movement and some of the people that may have been giving some support to the evil people, they were not, in my opinion, all of them evil per se. They were misguided. They came up in a segregated society. They truly believed what they had been taught, that the black race was inferior, and that integration would, they'd be quoted, they would change our way of life. And some of them, again, some of them were evil, but they all weren't. They were all wrong, and they were all misguided. But some of them really felt that they were doing the right thing. Just like a lot of times today, people think they're doing the right thing, and they're not. They're doing the wrong thing.
I just have to talk again now. I turned out to be a psychologist, so I do a publication now called Psychology Times. And I was going to say, that escalation of violence, it's not about evil in my view at all. I mean, there are people who do evil, but that escalation of violence, and it can happen, and people get carried further than their nature would in other situations carry them. And newspapers and journalists have a very calming effect on that process. And the secrecy is part of that escalation. So journalists who expose the facts have a calming effect on the conscious process.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit because Jack Tannehill in the Neshoba Democrat, if you go back and look what he was writing about, it was calling for calm and peace and all these things, and then it blew up.
That's one situation.
Well, but it was an important one because it was the Pearl Harbor Civil Rights Movement, and it's what eventually got the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act because it happened. It blew up.
Go ahead.
I have a question. A few years ago, Haley Barbour got in a lot of trouble saying the White Citizens Council was, had a positive role to play then as sort of the peaceful aspect of resistance. Going back, what's your analysis of the role of the Citizens Council? And is there any merit to what the governor said about the Citizens Council?
Sure. I don't think there's a lot of merit to it. The Citizens Council, they were resisting segregation just as much as the Klan was. They were doing it non-violently, but they would use economic pressure, peer pressure. Peer pressure is a powerful thing, and that peer pressure paralyzed a lot of people, or kept a lot of people from speaking out. I don't hold much respect for I respect some people that were in the Citizens Council. I think, again, they were misguided, but, and I respect them obviously more than I do the Ku Klux Klan that killed people. But they had to see go, and I don't see that they helped solve any problems back in those days.
We today, the Citizens Council rode the racehorse. We're riding the racehorse today in a non-violent manner, going in the opposite direction from what we did in the 50s and 60s, in apologizing to the minorities of the country for somebody having done them wrong. We see that in politics. In people who cater to the extremists, one side or another. I'm going to show some prejudice here, editorialize a second. Our United States Senate race is a pretty good example of that. How one candidate would serve a very small number of our people, but not the masses. And we're seeing, the Citizens Council it wasn't, in the town where I live now, they came there out of Greenwood, where it started, to organize, and the leadership in a private meeting room in a restaurant, one of the people stood up, the banker stood up and said, "Come on, man, we don't need these so-and-sos in town." And they had to walk out, and we never had one because it divided us, and we instead of being all working together. And now we've got a growing percentage of our population who says we owe them. And I get a little white-haired over that. I believe in opportunity, but I wonder where my obligation ends. That doesn't mean I've answered your question.
Well, I wanted to ask you guys a question. The Freedom Summer 64 it happened the same year as the Civil Rights Act was designated at its own. And then a year later, we had the Voting Rights Act, 1965. And it was last year that the Supreme Court took away some provisions that basically governed, basically it was a Justice Department oversight and changes to election laws and procedures in a bunch of southern states, including Mississippi. You know, it wasn't even, provisions weren't even on the book for 50 years. I mean, given what you've seen in the 60s and how everything's come to a circle today, I mean, do you think that was a premature decision with the Supreme Court decision?
What was the question?
With the removal of some of the Voting Rights Act provisions in the Supreme Court decision last year, basically the one that gives the Justice Department pre-clearance over election changes in Mississippi. I mean, do you think that was premature based on what you said?
You're talking about certain states that the Justice Department approved the future.
Mm-hmm.
You mean I think it was premature to remove? No, I personally don't think so. It's very easy to do register to vote. I mean, in 64 and then 65 when the Voting Rights Act was passed, I mean, that's what it was all about, getting voting rights for African American citizens. And they won. They succeeded. They got the right to vote. Unfortunately, they don't. It's not just blacks, just whites. In the election, we had mayor's race in McComb. What was it, 20% turnout or something like that?
Significantly, yeah.
So, you know, in my opinion, and there may be some place in Mississippi that I don't know about, but from my knowledge, it's not a problem for anybody to register to vote these days.
Matt Lane is telling me we have to wind up. Do you say anything exposing the
I think it's not so much the registering to vote, just to go a little bit further into that. I think it's the other things that people use to intimidate people who aren't coming to vote. Things like having to have identification or having a police presence at voter places. So those are I think that answers the question a little bit more. 50 years later, should we be able to take those things off? Yeah, we probably should. But once those things are taken off, are there going to be other ways that people will go about trying to, keep people from coming out to vote? That's the real issue.
I really don't foresee that. I may be mistaken, but so far on the voter ID, they're just a very, very small percentage of people that don't have one. And they're given an opportunity to go back and get it and bring it back.
It appears to me that 50 years later, we ought to find a new war to fight and create some national togetherness and move on to being a productive, working, prosperous society, as opposed to we've got people on both sides who are still living off whatever. And it's frustrating to me.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your help with this, and I appreciate your insights. Thanks for helping.
I've gained insight by getting to know my African American friends, and it's important to them that we still haven't fixed a lot of stuff, but we're working on it, like Doug said, and going forward. I will throw this in on the evil side of it. The German press asked me and compared it to Hitler, so that if the German press is looking at us and talking that way, that's an important thing to consider. So, but anyway, thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the day.